Welcome to Philomath Party. Today we're going to talk about the idea of ranked choice voting. Now, ranked choice voting has gotten a lot of press in the news lately. We've heard about several different states deciding to choose this new election idea of how do we actually tabulate the way people vote. And a lot of things that have led to this kinds of considerations, and including we've seen more polarizing candidates lately. And ranked choice voting is somehow supposed to fix some of those things. In fact, right now, something like 29 different states are actually considering bills to include ranked choice voting in some form or another in their state elections. Maine and a few other states have already started implementing some of these. Utah is actually piloting some of these programs at local levels to see if it actually makes a difference. But the question remains for most people, what in the world is ranked choice voting? What does it actually do? Does it actually help? And if it doesn't, then why are we doing it? And so what we're going to do today is we're actually going to look at how ranked choice voting actually does help, why it helps, and what it means for the regular person, like how it changes what it is that you're going to vote. So hopefully we'll have a lot of fun with this. We're going to take a look at a couple of different examples. First, we'll look at a two-person election. With two candidates, the situation is simple. There's really only one way that you can have people vote and interpret their votes. Each voter picks their favorite candidate, which shows that they prefer that candidate to the other. And since there are only two choices, this results in one of them receiving a majority of the vote. Whoever receives a majority is declared the winner. This is called the majority rule. In this example, we see an election between two candidates, Tom and Jimmy. After the electorate vote, we find that Tom received 52% of the vote and Jimmy received 48%, and so Tom is the winner. Unfortunately, with more than two candidates, it is common that no one receives a majority of the vote. As such, it can be difficult to identify what the electorate as a whole actually wants to have happen. To illustrate this issue, let's consider a three-candidate election between Abe, George, and Frankie. We will start off with the usual voting procedure that is especially typical in the United States. All voters go to the polls and vote for their favorite candidate. Suppose that we end up with Abe with 44% of the vote, George with only 20% of the vote, and Frankie with 36% of the vote. The usual method used in the United States would say at this point that Abe won the election because Abe received more votes than any other individual candidate. This is called the plurality rule. That is, the winner is whomever receives more votes than any other candidate. But note that a full 56% of voters, those that voted for George or Frankie together, voted for someone other than Abe. This begs the question of whether Abe is really whom the electorate prefers to win this election. For example, consider the 20% of the vote that George received. What if George had decided that he wasn't going to win the election and backed out before the actual election occurred? Well, then that 20% who voted for him will now vote for someone else. In this example, suppose that of that 20%, 18% prefer Frankie to Abe and the other 2% prefer Abe to Frankie. Then with George out of the picture, it's clear that Frankie would have received 54% of the vote, while Abe only received 46%. So which candidate is the most preferred one? It looks like Frankie is preferred to Abe by the electorate, so shouldn't Frankie win? Shouldn't the most preferred candidate always win? And even if we agree that the most preferred candidate should always win and that Frankie is preferred to Abe, notice that plurality can't detect that preference. So in order to find a way to better identify just what the electorate wants, we need a more robust voting system. And this is where ranked choice voting comes into play. Now let's take a look at the same election, but this time using ranked choice voting. We start in the same place. We have Abe, George, and Frankie. Abe receives 44% of the vote, George receives 20%, Frankie receives 36%. But now instead of having the voters just pick their favorite candidate, we'll instead have them rank order the candidates from most preferred to least preferred. Since we have three candidates, this produces 6 total possible orders. In particular, for those that preferred Abe the most, they might prefer George to Frankie or Frankie to George. That's 2 different preference lists or profiles for those that preferred Abe the most. Similarly, for George, there's some that prefer Frankie to Abe or Abe to Frankie. And finally, for Frankie, there's some that prefer George to Abe or Abe to George. These are the only 6 possible ways to order your preferences. So let's suppose that we have the electorate rank order the candidates instead of just voting for their first choice, and we find that 44% of the 44% that ranked Abe first, 38% preferred George to Frankie, and 6% prefer Frankie to George. As before, of the 20% that ranked George first, 18% prefer Frankie to Abe, and 2% prefer Abe to Frankie. Finally, of the 36% that ranked Frankie first, 33% prefer George to Abe, and only 3% prefer Abe to George. A list like this is called a preference profile, and it provides so much more information about what the electorate wants to have happen than just a list of their first choices. And that makes it possible for us to really try to identify just what the electorate is trying to say. Of course, that brings up the next question of just how do we do that? And there are lots of different ideas about how to interpret a preference profile. We will talk about a few of these in just a minute, but I want to point out first that no matter what method is used to interpret the preference profile, it doesn't change what we need voters to do. All that changes for the voter is that instead of just picking their first choice, they now have to rank order who they want to win. That's all there is for the voter to do. They just have to rank order the choices. Now let's take a look at a couple of ways to interpret this preference profile and compare it to plurality voting. In particular, we'll look at plurality voting, the instant runoff method, that's the one that's the most popular right now, and a lesser known rule called Coombs rule. First, let's look at plurality. This is the method that we are most accustomed to. It is simply whoever gets the most first place votes wins. In this case, the preference profile is unnecessary, and in this example, Abe received the most first place votes with 44%, and so plurality says that Abe wins this election. The next methods are runoff and instant runoff. I mentioned the runoff idea just briefly as it is typically not done with ranked choice voting. In a runoff election among several candidates, if no one receives a majority of the vote, then all candidates except the top two are eliminated and a second election is run. This second election always produces a majority winner, and that is who wins the election. This is what happened in the two 2020 Georgia Senate elections. An instant runoff tries to automate this process and improve it a little. In an instant runoff, the voters fill out their entire preference order. Once the votes are in, we look to see if anyone has a majority of first place votes. If they do, they are declared the winner. If no one has a majority of first place votes, then the candidate with the fewest first place votes is eliminated, and their votes are redistributed to the voter's second choice. In this case, George has the fewest first place votes with only 20%. He is eliminated, and his votes are redistributed. So here's the preference profile. Here, 18% of those voters that voted for George go to Frankie, since that many preferred Frankie to Abe, and 2% of those votes go to Abe, since that many George voters preferred Abe to Frankie. Then Frankie's new total is 54%, and Abe's is only 46%, and Frankie wins this election. I want to pause here and point out that one of the real positives of ranked choice voting is illustrated here. In plurality, the voices of the 20% of people who voted for George aren't heard. Instead, they're actually ignored as the election ends up only being between Frankie and Abe. Since that group is silenced, they have no way of influencing the election. This is why so many people refuse to vote their mind in an election. How often have we heard someone say that their preferred candidate doesn't have a chance, and so they have to vote between the two from the major parties if they want their vote to count? They can't vote what they actually think because it's like throwing their vote away. It's hardly a free election if you are disadvantaged by being honest. Ranked choice voting under whatever method allows the entire voice of the electorate to be heard. Every vote counts. In my opinion, this is the most desirable quality of ranked choice voting and why it supports democracy far more than what we currently do. Now let's take a look at another ranked choice voting method. This one was developed by the mathematical psychologist Clyde Coombs and is called Coombs rule. Earlier, I mentioned the fact that 56% of the electorate voted against Abe, and that might indicate that Abe is not the candidate that the electorate most prefers. Having said that, none of the voting methods we have mentioned thus far have taken that fact into account. Plurality, runoff, and instant runoff only consider who people want the most and don't consider what the electorate is saying about who they don't want the most. Coombs' rule is designed to highlight this part of the electorate's voice. In this case, note that of the three candidates, 18% of the 20% group that voted for George first listed Abe last, and 33% of the 36% that voted for Frankie first listed Abe last as well. This means that a majority of the electorate, 51%, have Abe listed as their last choice for this election. No other candidate will have that many last place votes. This indicates that Abe is the quote-unquote most hated candidate, and this rule is designed to address the problem of electing the most hated candidate. In fact, what it really does is try to prevent a truly polarizing candidate from being elected. In this election, Abe is the most polarizing candidate, as 44% of people want him more than anyone else, and 51% of people want anyone else more than him. It is arguable that such a person should not win the election, especially when a majority wants literally anyone else. What the Coombs rule does is after the voters have submitted their ranked preferences, it first checks to see if any candidate received a majority of first-place votes. If one of them did, then that candidate is the winner. If no one receives a majority of the first-place votes, we eliminate the candidate that has the most last-place votes and redo the process. In this case, that means that Abe is eliminated, and his votes are redistributed to the voters' second choices. Of the 44% of people that voted for Abe first, 38% preferred George to Frankie, and only 6% preferred Frankie to George. Then George's total increases to 58% of the vote, and Frankie's total increases to 42% of the vote, and George is declared the winner. So just to highlight the difference between instant runoff and Coombs rule, instant runoff tries to eliminate the least favorite candidate. Coombs rule, on the other hand, eliminates the most hated candidate. That's the way you can think about the difference between the two. Now, this might be somewhat disturbing. We just showed that in this election there was a method that elected each of the candidates in turn, and that might make this all feel a little arbitrary. Actually, what we're seeing is that what we're currently doing is often so bad at identifying what the electorate actually wants that all sorts of outcomes are possible. What we really need here is some way of identifying why one of these outcomes is more preferred than the others. To do that, we have to have some notion of what most preferred means. One way to define this is using the idea of a Condorcet winner and a Condorcet loser. These are named after a French philosopher and mathematician, Nicolas de Condorcet. The idea here is to try to identify who the most preferred candidate is using one-on-one pairwise runoffs. That is, we look at how each candidate fares in head-to-head matchups with each other candidate. A Condorcet winner is a candidate that wins each of the pairwise runoffs they're a part of. And this indicates that the electorate prefers that candidate to any other candidate. Such a person should always win an election. Now, it is possible that an election does not produce a Condorcet winner, but if there is one, a good election method should pick that person every time. In fact, an election method that always elects the Condorcet winner, if there is one, is said to satisfy the Condorcet winner criterion. Now, a Condorcet loser is the exact opposite of that idea. A candidate is a Condorcet loser if they lose every pairwise runoff that they're a part of. This indicates that the electorate prefers every other candidate to that one. Such a person should never win an election. In fact, they're the least preferred candidate. And there's a good argument that any good election method should never pick a Condorcet loser. In fact, an election method that never elects a Condorcet loser is said to satisfy the Condorcet loser criterion. This finally gives us a tool to potentially measure which of the three election methods we considered is best. So let's see if our election example has a Condorcet winner or a Condorcet loser, and how the methods we considered fared in finding them. To do this, we have to consider each pairwise runoff, that is, each head-to-head or one-to-one matchup. There are three of these: Abe versus George, Abe versus Frankie, and George versus Frankie. For Abe versus George, we look at what happens if Frankie hadn't run. Of the 36% that voted for Frankie first, 33% preferred George to Abe, and only 3% preferred Abe to George. When we redistribute these votes, Abe now has 47% and George has 53% of the vote. This means that George wins this pairwise runoff. Now we look at Abe versus Frankie. Here we look at what happens if George hadn't run. We saw this one before with the instant runoff method. Of the 20% that voted for George first, 18% preferred Frankie to Abe and only 2% preferred Abe to Frankie. When we redistribute these votes, Abe now has 46% and Frankie has 54%. This means that Frankie wins this pairwise runoff. This is interesting because this means that Abe lost both of the pairwise runoffs he was involved in. That means that Abe is the Condorcet loser of this election, and that is, the electorate prefers every other candidate to Abe. Finally, for George versus Frankie, we look at what happens if Abe hadn't run. We saw this one before with Coombs' rule. Of the 44% that voted for Abe first, 38% preferred George to Frankie, and only 6% preferred Frankie to George. When we redistribute these votes, George now has 58% of the vote and Frankie has 42%. This means that George wins this pairwise runoff. Now, of course, that means that George won both of the pairwise runoffs he was involved in. That makes George the Condorcet winner. That is, the electorate prefers George to any other candidate. Now let's see how each of the election methods fared in actually picking the Condorcet winner and avoiding picking the Condorcet loser. In the plurality vote, Abe won, but Abe is the Condorcet loser. The electorate prefers both George and Frankie to Abe, so why in the world should an election method identify Abe as the winner? This is actually the chief problem with plurality. Plurality voting not only fails at always picking the Condorcet winner, but it's actually capable of picking the Condorcet loser. This means that the plurality method fails both the Condorcet winner criterion and the Condorcet loser criterion. In the instant runoff method, Frankie won. Frankie was neither the Condorcet winner nor the Condorcet loser. Then instant runoff here avoided picking the Condorcet loser, but also failed to pick the Condorcet winner. This is actually generally true of instant runoff. The instant runoff method is superior to plurality in that it never elects a Condorcet loser, and so satisfies the Condorcet loser criterion. But it fails the Condorcet winner criterion and sometimes doesn't identify the Condorcet winner. In fact, this method actually eliminated the Condorcet winner, George, in the first round because it still was only making judgments based on the topmost information in the preference profile. And it is actually possible, as we saw here for instant runoff, to pick the second worst candidate. That is the candidate that loses in every pairwise runoff except for the one where they beat the Condorcet loser. So sometimes it might not be that much better than plurality voting. Finally, let's consider Coombs' rule. Coombs' rule elected George, who is the Condorcet winner and the most preferred candidate. It also avoided picking Abe, the Condorcet loser. These properties are generally true of Coombs' rule. Coombs' rule satisfies the Condorcet loser criterion and under very commonly true assumptions also satisfies the Condorcet winner criterion. There's actually a really neat recent scholarly article about Coombs' rule and how it compares to instant runoff. The link to that article is in the description of this video. Certainly then, of the three rules we have considered here, the method that best captured the actual opinion of the electorate was Coombs' rule. George should win this election because he is preferred by the electorate to both Abe and Frankie, and only Coombs' rule here elected him. Both plurality and instant runoff was not able to glean that information from the preference profile. So what we've seen with these three methods is that some of them satisfy nice properties and other ones don't. Plurality doesn't satisfy either of these Condorcet criterions and is actually a pretty terrible voting method. Its advantage, and the reason why it's used so much, is that it's really easy for the electorate to understand, which is another property that's really important for election methods to have. Ranked choice voting looks complicated to a lot of people, and so even though it has better properties, it's kind of a scary move for some people. But I want you to notice something about all the other methods that I talked about, whether we use the instant runoff method, Coombs' rule, or some other rule that uses ranked choice voting. The change for the electorate is the same. All the electorate has to do, the only difference for them, is that instead of electing their first place candidate, they rank order the candidates. Who's their first place choice, second place choice, third place choice. This has a lot of advantages. One of the advantages for the electorate itself is the electorate actually has to know a little bit about all the candidates in order to be able to make that decision. So it encourages voters to be more informed when they're making a choice. The second thing it does is it captures so much more information about what the electorate actually wants, rather than just the tiny bit of information that their first place choices would want. Having more information like this allows the public to make better decisions about what the public actually wants. And so the question at that point is, what is the right method that actually identifies what the electorate wants? And we've seen here that in between the two ranked choice voting methods we talked about, both instant runoff and Coombs' rule, at least in terms of whether or not it elects Condorcet winners and losers, Coombs' rule is actually the better method to use, but nobody's even talking about that one. And one of the unfortunate things that might happen here is that when we use instant runoff, which has some of the same lousy properties that plurality voting has, it might be that some of the electorate might feel like it didn't actually make a difference. I mean, the hope with ranked choice voting is that it prevents us from electing really polarizing candidates. But if it's still not electing Condorcet winners, it still may not be identifying what the electorate actually wants. And as a result, may look worse than it actually is. And since most people associate the term ranked choice voting with instant runoff, they might not realize that there are other methods out there. And so they might think that ranked choice voting didn't do anything, when it actually can. Now, it actually turns out that there's more fairness criteria to think about when you're talking about election methods. And there are a whole slew of other election methods designed specifically to try to address some of these issues, and some really surprising mathematical theorems about them. Unfortunately, we're kind of out of time here. This video is going a little long, and I don't want to overload you guys. So we'll talk about those on another video. Hey guys, thanks for watching my video today on Philomath Party. If you enjoyed today's video, consider giving it a like, and consider maybe subscribing and hitting that notification bell for this channel. It'll help us know what kinds of videos you guys like so we make more of them. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and we'll see you next time.